Have you ever met a woman who could hear a pin drop in a Category 5 hurricane? Meet Brenda. Before we get to the actual war crimes, you have to understand the battlefield. I had recently signed a lease in a hyper-manicured, aggressively beige homeowners association neighborhood down in Boca Raton, Florida. If you've never lived in a South Florida HOA, let me paint you a picture. It is a suburban dictatorship disguised as a paradise. Every single house is painted in one of 3 pre-approved, soul-crushing shades of oatmeal. You have desert sand, Navajo white, and my personal favorite, slightly damp cardboard. The grass in this neighborhood isn't just grass, it's a religious experience for these people. It is mandated to be cut to exactly 1 3/4 inches, not 2 inches, not 1 1/2, 1 3/4. If your mailbox leans even half a degree to the left, a SWAT team of bored retirees in golf carts descends on your property before the mailman even hits the end of the block. I moved there because the rent was surprisingly decent, and it was a 10-minute drive to my new job. I figured, how bad could it be? I am a simple guy. I don't throw wild parties. I don't have a collection of rusting muscle cars on my front lawn. I like quiet evenings, a cold beer, and strictly minding my own business. I figured I could just keep my head down, pay my dues, and survive the beige wasteland. My house had a little concrete slab of a back patio. It was entirely enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence, which was great, but it felt incredibly barren. Just a flat slab of gray concrete staring out at a perfectly flat, unnervingly green lawn. To make it feel somewhat like a home, I decided I needed a little bit of ambiance. I went to a local flea market on a Saturday afternoon. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for a plant, maybe a nice outdoor rug. Instead, I found an old guy selling handmade bamboo wind chimes out of the back of a van. Now, let me be very, very clear here. When I say wind chimes, I am not talking about those massive Gothic metal pipes that sound like a cathedral bell tower during an exorcism. I am not talking about the heavy iron clangers that summon thunderstorms. These were tiny. They were made of thin, hollowed-out bamboo stalks, suspended by cheap twine. I paid the man $12 in cash, brought them home, and hung them from a small metal hook on the edge of my patio awning. They emitted a gentle, woody clunk, clonk sound, maybe twice a day when a particularly ambitious breeze managed to roll through the thick, oppressive Florida humidity. They were completely harmless. They were peaceful. They sounded like a Zen garden taking a nap. They were, apparently, a declaration of thermonuclear war. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had gotten off work early and was sitting in a cheap plastic lawn chair on my patio. I had an iced tea in my hand, and I was just staring at the grass, trying to decompress. The humidity was sitting at around 90%. The air was thick, and the bamboo chimes gave a soft tock-tock as a slight breeze rolled by. Then I heard it. Clip, clop, clip, clop. It was the sound of purposeful, aggressive footwear hitting the pavement. The sound of a woman on a mission. I leaned forward in my chair and peered around the edge of my privacy fence. Marching up my driveway was a woman who looked like she subsisted entirely on a diet of white wine, Valium, and neighborhood gossip. She wore a visor that said, "Golf Life," in sparkly rhinestones. She had on a pastel pink polo shirt, crisp white capri pants, and pristine white tennis shoes. But it was her accessories that told the real story. In her left hand, she gripped a heavy-duty clipboard like it was the 10 Commandments. On her right hip, clipped to her belt loop, was a bright yellow measuring tape. She didn't ring the doorbell. She didn't knock. She marched straight up my driveway, bypassed the front door entirely, and walked across my lawn toward the backyard fence. "Excuse me!" a shrill, piercing voice barked over the fence. I stood up, walked over to the side gate, and opened it. Hi, can I help you?" She stood exactly 1 inch from my property line, hands on her hips, her clipboard pressed against her chest. "Are you the new tenant at Lot 412? "I guess so," I said. offering a friendly, albeit confused, smile. "I'm just renting the place. I'm Brenda," she interrupted, practically spitting the name at me. "I am the president of the Boca Raton Estates Homeowners Association." "Oh, nice to meet you, Brenda. Like I said, I just moved in about a—" Brenda held up a single, perfectly manicured, coral-painted fingernail. It was the universal sign for "shut your mouth, peasant." "We run a tight ship here at the estates," Brenda said, her eyes darting past my shoulder to scan my backyard. "We value property values. We value aesthetics. We do not tolerate deviations from the community standards." "Right. Completely understand," I said, trying to be diplomatic. "I keep things pretty tidy." Brenda's eyes suddenly locked onto the roof of my patio. She gasped. She literally gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had just witnessed me sacrificing a goat on the concrete slab. "What in the name of God is that?" she demanded, pointing her coral fingernail directly at my $12 flea market find. I looked back. They're wind chimes?" "Those," Brenda said, her voice dropping an octave into a terrifying, commanding growl, "are unauthorized noise-generating exterior fixtures." She reached down, unclipped her yellow measuring tape, and started aggressively snapping the metal casing against her palm. Snap, snap, snap. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, laughing a little bit because I genuinely thought she was messing with me. "They're just bamboo sticks on a string, Brenda." "They are explicitly forbidden under Article 7, Section 4 of the Community Guidelines," she yelled. Her voice was so loud that I saw Mr. Johnson, my neighbor 3 houses down, physically stop watering his petunias and turn his head to watch us. "Brenda, they barely make a sound," I reasoned, stepping out of the gate to face her. "You have to be standing directly underneath them to even hear them." Brenda took a step forward, crossing the invisible property line boundary, her face turning an impressive shade of crimson. "Do not lie to me, young man. I was sitting on my lanai, my private lanai 3 houses away, and I could hear that incessant, maddening clanging noise." "It doesn't clang," I corrected her. "It's wood. It kind of clonks." "It is disrupting my morning chakra alignment," Brenda shrieked. I froze. I blinked. "Your what?" "My chakra alignment," she repeated, stomping her crisp white tennis shoe into my grass. "My yoga instructor specifically told me that discordant, unregulated neighborhood noises throw off my inner balance. Those chimes are an auditory assault on my property rights." I stared at her. I couldn't help it. A tiny, involuntary laugh escaped my lips. I tried to suppress it, I really did, but the sheer absurdity of a grown woman in a rhinestone visor screaming about bamboo ruining her chakras was too much. That laugh was the biggest mistake I could have made. Brenda's eyes narrowed into tiny slits of pure, unadulterated HOA fury. The air between us seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I am not joking with you," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "This is a respectable community. We do not tolerate aesthetic deviations. We do not tolerate auditory nuisances. And we certainly do not tolerate insolent renters who think the rules do not apply to them." "Brenda, look," I sighed, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "I read the lease. I know there are rules, but it's just a decoration. I promise, if there's a hurricane, I'll take them down so they don't blow through a window. But on a normal Tuesday? They aren't hurting anyone." Brenda whipped a pen out from behind the clip of her board. She started furiously scribbling something down. "You have 24 hours to remove the contraband," she declared, without looking up. "Contraband?" I echoed. "Are you serious right now?" 24 hours, she repeated, finally looking up and glaring at me with the intensity of 1,000 burning suns. "Or you will face immediate financial penalties. And let me tell you something, Lot 412. If you want to play games with the board, you will lose. We have evicted people for less." She spun around on her heel, the measuring tape still swinging violently from her hip, and power walked her way down my driveway. She didn't look back. She just marched down the street, probably off to measure the exact distance between someone's trash cans and the curb. I stood in the grass, utterly bewildered. I looked at the bamboo chimes. A slight breeze rolled through. Clunk, talk. I shook my head, walked back inside, and locked the door. There was absolutely no way in hell I was taking them down. I figured she was just trying to establish dominance over the new guy. She was flexing her HOA muscles to see if I would flinch. Surely, I thought, she had better things to do than to formally document and police tiny pieces of wood. She was just having a bad day. Her chakras were probably just hungry. I was wrong. I was so incredibly, painfully wrong. The next few days passed in relative silence. I went to work, I came home, and I listened to my chimes. I purposely didn't look out the windows in the mornings, hoping to avoid any sight of a rhinestone visor. Then came Friday. I pulled into my driveway after a long, exhausting week of back-to-back meetings. All I wanted was a shower, a slice of pizza, and to not speak to another human being until Monday. I walked up to my front door, keys in hand, when I noticed the mailbox. The little red flag was down, but there was a thick, heavy envelope sticking halfway out of the slot. I grabbed it. It was printed on high-quality, heavy-stock paper. It wasn't regular mail. In the top left corner, embossed in gold foil, was the crest of the Boca Raton Estates Homeowners Association. My stomach gave a tiny, involuntary lurch. I unlocked the door, threw my keys on the counter, and ripped the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a highly aggressive, bolded Times New Roman font. Official notice of violation and financial penalty to the resident of Lot. 412. On Tuesday, the 14th, a formal inspection of your property revealed the presence of an unapproved noise-generating exterior fixture, hereinafter referred to as the Chimes, affixed to the rear patio structure. This is a direct violation of Article 7, Section 4 of the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, CC&Rs. You were given verbal warning and a 24-hour grace period to remove the contraband. A follow-up inspection on Thursday, the 16th, revealed the contraband was still in place. Consequently, a fine of $150 has been assessed to your ledger. Failure to pay this fine within 10 business days will result in late fees, restricted access to community amenities, including the pool and clubhouse, and potential legal action. Furthermore, the chimes must be removed immediately upon receipt of this notice. Signed, Brenda Vance, President, HOA Board of Directors. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the paper. $150 for wind chimes that cost me $12. I read the letter again. The sheer arrogance of it. The clinical legal language she used to describe a couple of hollowed-out sticks on a string. The chimes. The contraband. I walked over to the sliding glass door and looked out at the patio. They were hanging there, perfectly still in the heavy evening air. Most people would have backed down. Most people would have paid the fine, thrown the chimes in the trash, and grumbled about it to their friends over a beer. It wasn't worth the hassle. It wasn't worth the target on your back. But I am not most people. I walked over to my laptop, opened it up, and logged into the HOA resident portal. I found the ledger section. Sure enough, there was a bright red negative balance of $150 poured sitting next to my name. I pulled out my credit card. I typed in the numbers. I hit submit. The balance went to $0. I paid the fine. I figured in my head that I had just purchased a $150 permit to keep my $12 chimes. I had paid the troll toll. She got her money, I got my peace and quiet. I closed my laptop, ordered my pizza, and went to bed feeling like I had taken the high road. But Brenda didn't want the high road. Brenda wanted total submission. And over the next week, she launched a campaign of suburban harassment that would force me to dig into the deepest, darkest legal loopholes I could find to exact my revenge. The following Monday, the real psychological warfare began. I thought paying the fine was the end of it. I thought it was a transaction, $150 for the right to be left alone. I vastly underestimated the petty, vindictive stamina of an HOA president with too much free time. Brenda didn't just want my money. She wanted my total capitulation. Since she couldn't legally force me to take the chimes down after I paid the penalty, she decided to make my life a living hell in every other conceivable way. It started small, microaggressions of the suburban variety. I woke up on Tuesday morning, walked out to my driveway to head to work, and found a neon pink sticky note slapped directly onto the driver's side window of my car. It wasn't tucked under the wiper blade. It was stuck right in my line of sight with some kind of industrial strength adhesive. I peeled it off. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and aggressive. Please be mindful of community boundary standards. Your front left tire is resting 3/4 of an inch over the designated driveway concrete lip. This damages the communal grass. Next offense will result in a $50 fine. The board. I stared at my tire. It was, indeed, barely kissing the edge of the grass. Not crushing it, just resting near it. I crumpled the note, threw it in my passenger seat, and drove to work, grinding my teeth. On Wednesday, it was the trash cans. In Boca Raton Estates, trash day is Thursday morning. The rules clearly state that bins cannot be placed on the curb before 6 p.m. on Wednesday evening, and they must be returned to the garage by 8 p.m. on Thursday. I got home from work around 5:45 p.m. I was tired, I was hungry, and I just wanted to get my chores out of the way. I rolled my green plastic bin down the driveway and left it on the curb, exactly 15 minutes early. I didn't even make it inside my front door before I heard the shrill blast of a whistle, a literal, actual sports whistle. I turned around. Brenda was standing at the end of her driveway, 3 houses down, pointing at my trash can. She was wearing a matching yellow tracksuit today, and she had binoculars hanging around her neck. "Article 9, Section 2!" she screamed down the street, her voice carrying over the manicured lawns. "No receptacles on the curb before 1800 hours. You are 15 minutes in violation." "Are you serious right now, Brenda?" I yelled back, too exhausted to filter myself. "It's 5:45. Who cares?" "The property values care," she shrieked back. "Move it back to the garage, or I am assessing a penalty." I stood there for a full 10 seconds, debating whether or not to just take the fine. But the smug look on her face from 3 houses away made my blood boil. I marched back down the driveway, grabbed the handle of the bin, dragged it all the way back up to the garage, and sat on it. I sat on my trash can in my driveway for exactly 15 minutes, maintaining unbroken, hostile eye contact with Brenda, who was watching me through her binoculars. When my watch hit exactly 6 p.m., I dragged it back to the curb, gave her a sarcastic thumbs up, and went inside. By Friday, the tension was unbearable. I felt like I was living in a panopticon. I couldn't open my blinds without wondering if Brenda was lurking in the bushes with her yellow measuring tape. I couldn't check my mail without bracing myself for another citation. But through it all, my little bamboo wind chimes stayed right where they were. They were my one tiny act of rebellion. Every time I heard that soft clonk, it felt like a victory. Until Friday evening. I had survived another brutal week at the office. I had stopped at the grocery store on the way home, bought a 6-pack of decent IPA, and ordered some Thai takeout. I pulled into the driveway, specifically checking my tire placement to ensure I was fully within the concrete borders. I carried my groceries inside, threw my keys on the counter, and let out a massive sigh of relief. The weekend was here. 2 full days, where I didn't have to wear a tie, didn't have to answer emails, and could just sit on my patio. I grabbed a cold beer, cracked it open, and slid the heavy glass door open to step onto the patio. I looked up to check on my chimes. The hook was empty. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable flutter in my chest. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking maybe the Florida heat was getting to me. I looked at the concrete floor of the patio, thinking maybe the twine had finally given out and they had fallen. Nothing. The patio was completely bare. I walked out into the grass, looking around the yard. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself. "Did someone steal them? Why would someone steal a $12 piece of bamboo? And then I saw it. Sitting against the side of my house was my secondary outdoor trash can, the one I kept by the gate for yard clippings. The lid was slightly ajar. Protruding from beneath the heavy plastic lid was a frayed piece of twine. I walked over to the bin. My hands were actually shaking a little bit, not from fear, but from a sudden, white-hot surge of adrenaline. I grabbed the lid and flipped it back. There, resting on top of a pile of dead palm fronds, were my wind chimes. They hadn't just been thrown away. They had been aggressively, intentionally destroyed. The bamboo stalks were snapped in half, the wood splintered and jagged. The twine had been cut in multiple places. It looked like someone had taken a pair of heavy-duty garden shears to them and then stomped on the remains for good measure. Taped to the inside of the trash can lid was another neon pink sticky note. Neighborhood emergency removal executed due to persistent non-compliance and auditory endangerment. A $50 cleanup and disposal fee has been added to your ledger. Do not attempt to replace the contraband. Brenda. I stood there, staring into the trash can for a very, very long time. The beer in my hand started to sweat, condensing and dripping onto the hot concrete. She had trespassed onto my rented property. She had come through my closed privacy gate. She had destroyed my personal belongings. And then, as the absolute cherry on top of this unhinged sundae, she had charged me $50 for the privilege of throwing my broken property into my own trash can. A normal person might have called the police. But let's be real. What were the Boca Raton police going to do? Send a CSI team to dust for fingerprints on a broken stick? They would tell me it was a civil matter, tell me to take it up with the HOA, and drive away laughing. A normal person might have marched over to Brenda's house and screamed at her until their lungs gave out. But that's exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to look crazy. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could call the cops on me and have me cited for disturbing the peace. I realized, standing there over the ruins of my chimes, that anger was useless here. Anger is loud, sloppy, and easily defeated by bureaucracy. If I was going to destroy Brenda, I had to be cold. I had to be calculating. I had to use the very weapon she wielded like a club against her. I had to use the rule book. I walked back inside, locked the sliding door, and set my beer on the counter. I didn't drink it. I needed to be entirely sober for this. I walked into my home office, opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and pulled out the massive, 3-inch thick binder that the leasing agent had handed me on the day I moved in. The Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CCNRs, the sacred text of the Boca Raton estates. I dropped the heavy binder onto the kitchen table with a loud thud. I grabbed a fresh notepad, 3 different colored highlighters, and a massive mug of black coffee. I opened the binder to page 1. "All right, Brenda," I whispered to the empty room. "Let's see what you're working with." I spent the next 6 hours reading. I didn't eat my Thai food. I didn't check my phone. I read every single archaic, suffocating, absurd rule that had been drafted by a committee of control freaks back in 1998. I read about the exact Pantone color codes approved for front doors. There were only 2. I read about the prohibition on commercial vehicles being parked in driveways for more than 45 minutes. I read a 10-page section detailing the approved flora and fauna for front-facing garden beds, which explicitly banned anything that produced fruit, because fruit attracts birds, and birds are messy. By 2 a.m., my eyes were burning. The words were starting to blur together into a meaningless soup of legalese. I had found plenty of stupid rules, but nothing I could use as a weapon. Nothing that would give me the kind of catastrophic, malicious compliance victory I was looking for. I flipped to page 214. Section 7. Nuisances and noise. I found the exact clause she used to fine me. Section 7.4. No noise-generating exterior art, machinery, or domestic pets, including but not limited to dogs and cats, She'll be permitted to create a sustained nuisance, disrupt the peace of neighboring parcels, or exceed to 60 decibels during daylight hours. It was a completely subjective rule, designed specifically so the board could ban whatever they wanted by simply declaring it a nuisance. It was ironclad. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building behind my eyes. I was about to give up, close the binder, and just accept defeat. But my eyes drifted down to the bottom of the page. There was a small, italicized cross-reference note. See Article 4, Section B regarding environmental and agricultural exceptions. Agricultural exceptions? In a neighborhood where you couldn't even grow a lemon tree? I frantically flipped back through the heavy pages until I found Article 4. I skimmed past the rules on fertilizer runoff and lawn watering schedules, and then, nestled quietly at the bottom of page 88, I found it. Article 4, Section B, Environmental and Agricultural Exceptions. In accordance with Palm Beach County Sustainability and Urban Homesteading Initiatives established in 1996, residents may keep up to two legally classified agricultural poultry on their property. I stopped reading. I blinked hard. I read the sentence again, tracing the words with my finger. Up to two legally classified agricultural poultry. In the mid-90s, there was a brief, highly publicized push in South Florida for urban homesteading. People wanted to be self-sufficient. They wanted fresh eggs. The HOA, likely pressured by the county at the time, had drafted this loophole to allow residents to keep a couple of hens in the backyard. But as I read the rest of the clause, my jaw slowly dropped. Provided said poultry are kept in a securely framed, predator-proof enclosure constructed to strict county building codes. No poultry may be permitted to roam free outside the designated enclosure. The enclosure must be situated entirely within the rear property lines. There were no amendments. There were no repeals. The rule was still sitting right there, active and completely legal, because no one in this neighborhood of wealthy retirees and neurosurgeons had ever wanted to raise farm animals. They meant chickens. Obviously, they meant chickens, but the wording was so specific. Legally classified agricultural poultry. I pushed the binder aside, grabbed my laptop, and opened a new browser window. My fingers were flying across the keyboard. I searched the Palm Beach County agricultural zoning codes. I dug through the state agricultural definitions. I needed to know exactly what the government considered to be poultry. The county website loaded. I scrolled down to the definitions section. Poultry. Domestic fowl, such as chickens, turkeys, ducks, or geese, raised for meat or eggs. Okay, standard stuff. I kept scrolling, digging into the subclassifications of the zoning ordinances. And then, buried deep in a PDF document detailing the taxation and registration of exotic game birds, I found the holy grail of legal loopholes. Under Florida State Agricultural Guidelines, adopted by Palm Beach County zoning authorities, the definition of poultry extended to all birds falling under the taxonomic family of Phasianidae, provided they were bred in captivity for agricultural, ornamental, or exhibition purposes. I opened a new tab. I typed in Phasianidae. Wikipedia loaded instantly. I stared at the screen, a slow, sinister, absolutely unhinged smile spreading across my face. The blue light of the monitor illuminated my dark kitchen, and I started to laugh. I laughed so hard my chest physically ached. I laughed until tears were streaming down my face. The family Phasianidae includes pheasants, partridges, jungle fowl, and chickens. But it also includes the genus Pavo, Pavo cristatus, the Indian blue peacock. Legally, technically, and undeniably, according to the state of Florida and Palm Beach County, a peacock is agricultural poultry. Brenda destroyed my $12 bamboo wind chimes because the soft clonk disrupted her chakras. She thought she had won. She thought she had established dominance. She had no idea that she had just authorized me, through her own sacred rulebook, to bring the loudest, most obnoxious, legally protected screaming machines on the planet directly into her backyard. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up with a singular burning purpose. I didn't care about the cost anymore. This was about sending a message. This was about malicious compliance on a biblical scale. My first step was the infrastructure. The HOA rule was very clear. Kept in a securely framed, predator-proof enclosure constructed to strict county building codes. I couldn't just throw up some cheap chicken wire and some 2x4s. Brenda would be over here with a tape measure and a code enforcement officer in 5 minutes. If I was going to do this, the enclosure had to be a fortress. It had to be permitted, inspected, and bulletproof. I spent the morning making phone calls. Most contractors laughed at me when I told them I needed a rush job on a bird cage. Finally, I got a hold of Mike. Mike owned a custom outdoor living company. He usually built massive $50,000 outdoor kitchens and luxury pergolas for the rich guys down in Boca. But when I explained that I had cash, and I needed something built fast, he agreed to swing by my house to give me an estimate. Mike pulled up to my house around noon in a massive, lifted Ford F-250. He stepped out of the truck wearing work boots, faded jeans, and a t-shirt that said, "Salt Life." He was a burly, sun-baked Florida native with a thick beard and mirrored sunglasses. He looked completely out of place in our neighborhood of Teslas and pristine golf carts. I met him in the driveway and walked him back to the patio. "All right, brother, what are we looking at?" Mike asked, pulling a tape measure from his belt and a notepad from his back pocket. "You said on the phone you needed an enclosure. You got dogs that keep jumping the fence?" "Not exactly, Mike," I said, gesturing to the grassy area directly behind the concrete patio. "I need an agricultural poultry enclosure, a coop, but it needs to be built to maximum county specs. Poured concrete footings, heavy-duty pressure-treated framing, wrapped in half-inch galvanized hardware cloth. It needs a reinforced roof, and it needs to be permitted." Mike stopped writing. He slowly lowered his mirrored sunglasses to the bridge of his nose and looked at me. Then he looked around the hyper-manicured, aggressively beige neighborhood. "A chicken coop," Mike said slowly, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You want me to build a high-security chicken coop in Boca Raton Estates?" "Yes." "Man, you're renting this place, right? The HOA is going to skin you alive. I do work in this neighborhood all the time. These people are psychos. They'll fine you for breathing too hard." "I have it entirely handled on the legal front," I assured him, pulling out a printed copy of the HOA bylaws and handing it to him. "Article 4, Section B. I am legally entitled to 2 agricultural poultry." Mike took the paper, read it, and shook his head, a grin starting to form under his beard. "All right, man. It's your funeral. How big are these chickens you're getting?" "They're specialized game birds," I said carefully. "I'm going to need the enclosure to be at least 10 feet wide, 20 feet long, and I need a 10-foot vertical clearance." Mike stared at me. He looked at his tape measure, then looked back at me. 10 feet tall? Brother, what kind of chickens fly 10 feet in the air?" "The expensive kind," I replied deadpan. "I also need heavy-duty wooden roosting bars installed at the 6-foot and 8-foot marks. Can you do it? And can you start Monday?" Mike shoved his sunglasses back up his nose and let out a booming laugh. "You're out of your mind, buddy. But yeah, I can pull the permit on Monday morning as a standard outbuilding, and I'll have a crew here by noon. It ain't gonna be cheap, though. Custom framing, concrete, heavy gauge mesh. You're looking at $4,000 easy." "I don't care," I said, and I meant it. "Just make sure it is exactly to county code. No shortcuts." "You got it, boss. Do these monster chickens bite?" "Only if you're wearing beige," I smiled. "Like the HOA president." Mike chuckled, slapped my shoulder, and headed back to his truck. The trap was officially set. Now I just had to wait for Brenda to walk into it. Monday morning arrived. The Florida sun was beating down, the humidity was already suffocating, and the neighborhood was dead quiet. At exactly 11:45 a.m., the peace was shattered by the roaring diesel engine of Mike's F-250, followed closely by a massive flatbed truck loaded with lumber, bags of concrete, and rolls of steel mesh. They didn't park on the street. They backed directly onto my driveway, the reverse alarm of the flatbed screaming beep, 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 echoing off the beige houses. A crew of 4 guys hopped out. They were loud. They were playing classic rock from a heavy-duty job site radio. They immediately started hauling lumber into the backyard and firing up the post hole diggers. The noise was glorious. The roar of a gas-powered auger chewing through the pristine Boca Raton soil was music to my ears. I made myself a sandwich, stood in my kitchen, and watched the chaos unfold through the glass doors. It took exactly 12 minutes for Brenda to appear. I saw her marching down the street from my kitchen window. She wasn't just walking, she was practically vibrating with rage. She was wearing her rhinestone visor, her clipboard was clutched in her hand, and she had her cell phone pressed to her ear. She bypassed the driveway entirely and stormed straight across my lawn, ignoring the keep off grass signs she herself had mandated. She threw open my side gate and marched into the backyard, walking directly into an active construction zone. "Shut it down!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she tried to yell over the sound of the gas auger. "Shut this down immediately!" Mike, who was currently marking out the concrete footings with neon orange spray paint, stood up. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, pushed his mirrored sunglasses up, and looked down at the furious woman in the pink polo shirt. "Excuse me, lady, you can't be back here," Mike said loudly. "This is an active job site. You need a hard hat." "I am the president of the HOA!" Brenda shrieked, waving her clipboard in Mike's face. "This is an unauthorized structural addition. You do not have architectural committee approval for a pergola. Cease work immediately or I will have the police arrest you for trespassing." I decided it was time to make my entrance. I wiped my hands on a paper towel, grabbed my meticulously prepared folder off the counter, and slid the glass door open. "Morning, Brenda," I called out cheerfully, stepping onto the patio. "Beautiful day for some home improvement, isn't it?" Brenda whipped her head around. If looks could kill, I would have spontaneously combusted on the concrete. She stomped over to me, getting so close I could smell the strong, acidic scent of her hairspray. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "You did not submit plans to the architectural committee. You are in direct violation of Article 12 regarding unapproved outbuildings. I am shutting this down, and I am fining you $500 for unauthorized construction." "Actually, Brenda, I'm not in violation of anything," I said smoothly. I opened my folder and pulled out the crisp white document Mike had handed me that morning. I held it out to her. "Here is the approved Palm Beach County building permit for a Class 3 agricultural outbuilding." Brenda snatched the paper out of my hand. Her eyes darted aggressively over the text. "Agricultural outbuilding?" she scoffed, looking at me like I was insane. "Are you out of your mind? This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm. You cannot build a barn in your backyard." "It's not a barn," I corrected her, keeping my voice perfectly calm and polite. I pulled the second document from my folder, a highlighted copy of the CCNRs. "It is a predator-proof poultry enclosure, exactly as mandated by Article 4, Section B of our own HOA bylaws. I am exercising my right to keep 2 legally classified agricultural poultry." Brenda froze. She looked down at the highlighted text. She read it once. She read it again. I watched as her brain struggled to process the information. She had written me a citation based on this exact rulebook just a week ago, and now I was hitting her in the face with it. "Poultry?" she whispered. "Yes, ma'am," I smiled. The shock quickly morphed into absolute, unfiltered smugness. Brenda let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. She handed the papers back to me, shaking her head. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think you found a clever little loophole? You think you're going to get back at me for the wind chimes by building a chicken coop?" "I'm just following the rules, Brenda," I replied innocently. "Just like you told me to." "Well, you listened to me, you arrogant little punk," she snapped, stepping closer and pointing her coral fingernail directly at my chest. "You might have a permit for the wood and the wire, but the second you bring a filthy, disease-ridden, clucking chicken onto this property, I will have animal control here so fast your head will spin. We have noise ordinances. The second your little rooster crows, you are in violation of Section 7. I will fine you until you are bankrupt, and then I will have the board seize your property." She smiled a tight, terrifying smile. "You cannot win this." She turned around and marched out of the backyard, slamming the gate behind her. Mike walked over, holding his spray paint can, and watched her march down the street. "Man," Mike muttered, shaking his head. "That lady is wound tighter than a snare drum. You sure you know what you're doing? She ain't wrong about the noise ordinances. Chickens are loud." I looked at the empty space where the enclosure was about to be built. I thought about the broken bamboo chimes sitting in the bottom of my trash can. I turned to Mike and smiled a smile that was entirely too big for my face. "Mike," I said, clapping him on the shoulder, "I'm not bringing in chickens. Just get the roof reinforced. I have a long drive ahead of me on Thursday." The enclosure took 3 full days to complete, and I have to hand it to Mike. He didn't cut a single corner. By Wednesday evening, my backyard had been transformed. Where there was once a patch of perfectly manicured, aggressively unremarkable grass, there now stood a structure that looked like a holding pen for a velociraptor. It was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. It was 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, and towered 10 feet into the air. The frame was built from heavy-duty, pressure-treated lumber, anchored deep into poured concrete footings. The entire thing was wrapped in thick, half-inch galvanized steel hardware cloth. It was completely predator-proof, weather-proof, and, most importantly, Brenda-proof. Mike even went the extra mile and painted the wooden framing the exact HOA-mandated shade of desert sand so that the architectural committee couldn't cite me for an unapproved color palette. I paid Mike in cash, shook his hand, and spent Wednesday night pacing my living room, practically buzzing with anticipation. Thursday morning, I called out of work, citing a family emergency. Then, I drove down to the local U-Haul and rented a windowless white cargo van. It was time to go shopping. I hit the Florida Turnpike and headed north. I drove for 3 solid hours, leaving the pristine, sterile suburbs of Palm Beach County behind, venturing deep into the swampy, moss-draped heart of Central Florida. My destination was a sprawling, off-the-grid agricultural compound on the outskirts of Ocala. I had found the breeder on a deeply obscure internet forum dedicated to exotic ornamental fowl. When I pulled the cargo van up to the rusted chain-link gate, a man who looked like he had been born wearing denim overalls walked out to meet me. His name was Hank. He had a massive white beard, a chew of tobacco tucked permanently into his lower lip, and he was missing the top half of his left index finger. "You the guy from Boca?" Hank asked, leaning against the window of the van. He spat a stream of brown juice onto the dirt. "The one looking for the mature males?" "That's me," I said, stepping out into the sweltering heat. The air here smelled heavily of feed, damp earth, and an overwhelming amount of bird droppings. "All right, follow me," Hank grunted. "But keep your hands in your pockets. The emus are in a mood today, and they will absolutely take a chunk out of you." I followed Hank past rows of massive wire mesh aviaries. The noise was incredible. There were hundreds of birds screaming, clucking, honking, and gobbling. We passed pens full of aggressive-looking turkeys, cages of manic guinea fowl, and a terrifying enclosure holding 3 massive ostriches that tracked my every movement with cold, dead eyes. Finally, we reached a large, shaded aviary at the very back of the property. Hank unlatched the heavy wooden door, stepped inside, and whistled. And there they were. They were absolutely massive. Pictures do not do them justice. When you see an adult male Indian blue peacock up close, the sheer size of them is intimidating. Their bodies were large and heavy, supported by thick, scaly, dinosaur-like legs with sharp spurs on the back. Their necks were a brilliant, iridescent electric blue that seemed to glow even in the shade. And trailing behind them, stretching for nearly 5 feet, were their magnificent tail trains, heavy with hundreds of tightly packed green and gold feathers. They moved with a jerky, paranoid elegance, their little heads swiveling back and forth, the tiny crowns of feathers on their heads bobbing with every step. "Beautiful, ain't they?" Hank said, admiring them with a proud nod. "These are my 2 best remaining bachelor males. 3 years old, full plumage, healthy as horses. But I gotta warn you, son." Hank turned to me, fixing me with a completely serious, unblinking stare. "These boys got lungs. You said you were taking these down to Boca Raton?" "I am," I confirmed. Hank let out a low whistle and shook his head. "You got neighbors?" "I do," I smiled. "I really, really do." Hank stared at me for a long moment. He looked at my smile, then he looked at the birds. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face, parting his white beard. He didn't ask questions. He understood. "God have mercy on their souls," Hank chuckled. "All right, let's get 'em boxed up." Getting them into the heavy-duty wooden transport crates was an ordeal. They did not want to go. They hissed, they flapped their massive wings, and they kicked at the wire. But Hank handled them with the practiced ease of a man who fought giant birds for a living. Within 20 minutes, both birds were secured in separate crates, and we loaded them into the back of the sweltering U-Haul van. I handed Hank a thick envelope of cash. He counted it, tucked it into his overalls, and tipped an imaginary hat to me. "Good luck, son. Don't park near a mirror, or they'll try to fight their own reflection until they drop dead." I drove the 3 hours back to Boca Raton in complete silence. The radio was off. Every time I hit a bump on the turnpike, I could hear the rustle of heavy feathers and the scratch of sharp claws against the wooden floors of the crates. My heart was pounding. I felt like I was transporting weapons-grade uranium into a civilian zone. I pulled into my neighborhood just as the sun was beginning to set. The timing was perfect. Boca Raton Estates at 6:30 p.m. is a picture of serene, oppressive tranquility. The landscaping crews have all gone home. The retirees are sitting on their screened-in lanais, sipping gin and tonics, listening to the gentle hum of their central air conditioning units. It is quiet. It is peaceful. I backed the white U-Haul van right up to the edge of my driveway, as close to the side gate as I could get. I threw the van into park, took a deep breath, and walked around to the back doors. I unlatched the heavy metal handles and swung the doors wide open. I grabbed the heavy handles of the first crate, gritted my teeth, and hauled it out of the van. I muscled it through the side gate, dragged it across the grass, and shoved it through the reinforced door of the new enclosure. I ran back, grabbed the second crate, and repeated the process. I stood inside the enclosure, the door securely latched behind me. I looked at the 2 wooden boxes. I had spent nearly $4,000, driven 6 hours, and dedicated a week of my life to this exact moment. I reached down, unlatched the door of the first crate, and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. The box was completely still. Then, a massive electric blue head poked out of the darkness. The bird looked left. He looked right. He took a hesitant, jerky step forward and then practically tumbled out of the crate, dragging his massive 5-foot tail behind him. I opened the second crate. The second bird followed suit, looking slightly more frantic than the first. I had named them on the drive down. The larger, slightly more aggressive-looking one was Lord Shen. The slightly smaller, derpy-looking one with a tendency to stare blankly at the wall was Kevin. I stepped out of the enclosure and locked the heavy padlock on the outside. I stood on the patio and just watched them. The visual contrast was immediate and absolutely jarring. In a backyard completely surrounded by endless beige fencing, beige houses, and perfectly uniform, artificially green grass, this sudden explosion of vibrant, exotic color felt like a glitch in the matrix. They were so wildly out of place. They paced the enclosure, inspecting the thick wooden roosting bars Mike had built, pecking at the specialized game bird feed I had poured into a heavy rubber trough. They were surprisingly quiet. Just the soft rustle of feathers and the occasional low guttural cluck as they communicated with each other. For a brief, terrifying 20 minutes, I thought maybe I had made a massive miscalculation. Maybe I had bought defective peacocks. Maybe they were mute. Maybe the humidity of South Florida had somehow suppressed their vocal cords. I cracked open a beer and sat down in a lawn chair on the patio, watching them. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Florida sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. Kevin stopped pacing. He stood in the center of the enclosure, right on top of a pile of pine shavings. He stretched his long blue neck upward, pointing his beak directly toward the darkening sky. He puffed his massive chest out, ruffling his neck feathers until he looked twice his size. He took a deep, visible breath. And then he opened his beak. Ah! I physically recoiled in my chair, spilling half my beer on my jeans. If you have never heard an adult peacock scream in person, you cannot possibly comprehend the sheer volume and piercing frequency of the sound. It does not sound like a bird. It doesn't cluck, or chirp, or gobble, or crow. It sounds exactly, precisely like an adult human woman screaming for her absolute life through a distorted, over-amplified megaphone. It is a desperate, shrieking wail that cuts straight through glass, penetrates drywall, and rattles the fillings in your teeth. Lord Shen, clearly startled by Kevin's outburst, decided he needed to establish dominance. He puffed his chest out, threw his head back, and responded. Ah! The noise was deafening. It echoed off the concrete walls of my house. It bounced over the 6-foot privacy fences. It soared over the pristine golf course across the street. They began a call and response routine. Kevin would scream. Lord Shen would scream back. It was a chaotic, high-decibel symphony of terror. I sat back in my chair, completely covered in spilled beer, and I smiled. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Within 90 seconds, the neighborhood began to react. The security light on the back of the Johnsons' house snapped on, flooding their patio with harsh white light. I could hear a dog start barking hysterically 3 streets over. Across the golf course, someone yelled something indistinguishable, but the tone was pure panic. I heard a sliding glass door slam open next door. Mr. Johnson stepped out onto his lanai, wearing a silk bathrobe, holding a golf club like a baseball bat. He was looking wildly up at the sky, spinning in circles, completely unable to pinpoint where the ungodly screaming was coming from. Ah! Lord Shen shrieked, strutting back and forth along the hardware cloth. Mr. Johnson froze, dropping the head of the golf club to the concrete. He stared at my backyard, his jaw hanging open in sheer disbelief. He couldn't see the birds through the privacy fence, but he could hear them. My God, could he hear them? The boys kept it up for a solid 20 minutes. Just relentless, ear-splitting shrieks. Finally, as the sky turned completely black, they seemed to decide they had made their point. They fluttered awkwardly up to the highest wooden roosting bar, settled their massive bodies down, and went completely silent. I finished my beer, walked inside, and locked the door. I knew tonight was just the dress rehearsal. The real show was going to start tomorrow morning. Here is a fun, terrible fact about peafowl that Hank had shared with me. They are not roosters. A rooster will usually wait until the sun actually comes up to start crowing. Peacocks are different. They do not care about the sun. The moment the sky even thinks about turning a slightly lighter shade of black, they announce their presence to the world. They are nature's most obnoxious alarm clock. I went to bed in the guest room, put in a pair of heavy-duty foam earplugs, and set my phone alarm for 4:45 a.m. I woke up before the alarm. The anticipation was too much. I brewed a massive pot of coffee, walked out to the kitchen island, and watched the digital clock on the microwave. 4:58 a.m. 4:59 a.m. 5:00 a.m. The sky outside the window was pitch black, not a hint of dawn. 5:05 a.m. I was starting to worry they were sleeping in. And then it happened. Ah! Even through the double-paned hurricane glass of the sliding door, the sound hit me like a physical blow. It was louder in the crisp, still morning air. It was sharper, more urgent. Ah! Kevin joined in. It was a duet of absolute auditory destruction. I grabbed my mug of coffee and walked out onto the patio. The boys were wide awake, pacing the top roost, screaming into the darkness. I sat down in my lawn chair and waited. It took exactly 15 minutes for the neighborhood to lose its collective mind. I could hear front doors slamming. I heard car alarms going off, triggered by the sheer panic of the neighborhood dogs. Voices were shouting over the fences. By 5:30 a.m., the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting a gray light over the street. And marching down the center of the road, moving with a terrifying, unhinged speed, was Brenda. She wasn't wearing her visor. Her hair was completely disheveled, sticking up in wild clumps. She was wearing a hot pink velvet tracksuit, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in the last 30 minutes. She marched straight up my driveway, bypassed the front door, and headed straight for the side gate. She didn't knock. She threw her shoulder into the wood, slammed the gate open, and stumbled into the backyard. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Good morning, Brenda," I called out brightly. "You're up early?" Brenda stopped dead in her tracks. She stared at the 10-foot-tall, desert sand-colored fortress dominating my yard. She stared at the two massive, iridescent blue birds pacing behind the wire. Kevin stopped pacing, looked directly at Brenda through the mesh, and let out a point-blank, window-rattling wail. Brenda actually screamed. She slapped her hands over her ears and stumbled backward, almost tripping over a paver stone. What in the name of God is that?" she shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically. "It sounds like someone is being murdered." "Oh, them?" I smiled, gesturing with my coffee mug. "That's just Lord Shen and Kevin, my agricultural poultry. They're just waking up. You know how it is. Getting that morning chakra alignment going. I find their natural vibrations really center the property." Brenda's jaw practically unhinged. She stood there, vibrating with a rage so profound I thought she might actually have a stroke on my lawn. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Just a strangled, high-pitched squeak. She dropped her hands from her ears and pointed a trembling, coral-painted fingernail directly at my face. "I am calling the police," she hissed, her voice dropping into a terrifying, guttural register. "I am calling the police. I am calling animal control. I am calling the Department of Health. You are going to jail. You are going to rot in a cell." She didn't wait for a response. She spun around on her pink velvet heel and power-walked out of the yard, pulling her cell phone out of her pocket before she even cleared the gate. I chuckled, took another sip of my coffee, and walked back inside. It was time to deploy the final weapon. I walked into my home office and picked up the heavy, black, 3-ring binder sitting on my desk. I had spent the last 2 nights curating this masterpiece. It was meticulously organized, tabbed with color-coded sticky notes, and printed on high-quality paper. Inside was the Palm Beach County Agricultural Code, specifically highlighting the legal definition of phasianidae. There was the zoning map, proving my property fell within the legal guidelines for agricultural exceptions. There were the receipts from Hank, proving they were captive-bred domestic fowl, not wild animals. There was a copy of the finalized, approved building permit for the enclosure, signed by the county inspector. And sitting proudly on the very first page, slipped inside a pristine plastic sleeve, was a copy of the HOA's own Article 4, Section B. I walked out the front door, closed it behind me, and sat down on the small concrete stoop in my driveway, resting the binder of justice on my lap. I didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, 2 Boca Raton police cruisers turned the corner onto my street. They weren't using their sirens, but their light bars were flashing, casting red and blue reflections against the beige houses. They rolled slowly down the street and parked haphazardly in front of my driveway, blocking me in. Brenda was already waiting for them on the curb. The moment the doors opened, she was on them. 2 officers stepped out. The first was a young guy, maybe mid-20s, who looked completely lost. The second was a grizzled, heavy-set veteran with a thick silver mustache who looked like he was about 3 weeks away from a very comfortable pension and had zero patience for suburban nonsense. Brenda immediately started waving her arms frantically, pointing at my house. "Arrest him!" she screamed, practically jumping up and down. "He's running an illegal menagerie. He has some kind of exotic screaming beasts in his backyard. It's a public health hazard. It's a noise violation. Arrest him and confiscate the animals." I stood up, dusted off my jeans, tucked the binder under my arm, and walked slowly down the driveway to meet them. "Morning, officers," I said calmly, keeping my hands visible and my demeanor entirely respectful. The older cop tipped his hat, resting his thumbs heavily on his duty belt. "Morning, sir. We received a frantic 911 call from the HOA president here regarding, well, illegal exotic zoo animals causing a severe disturbance." "He's terrorizing the neighborhood!" Brenda shrieked from behind the cop. "Listen, just listen!" Right on cue, as if he possessed a supernatural sense for comedic timing, Lord Shen let out a deafening, echoing wail from the backyard. "Ah!" Both cops physically jumped. The younger cop's hand instinctively shot down to rest on the grip of his taser. His eyes went wide as saucers. "Jesus Christ," the older cop muttered, taking a step back and looking toward the roof of my house. "Sir, what the hell is that? That is not a dog." "No, sir, it is not a dog," I replied politely. "And it's certainly not an exotic zoo animal. I am a law-abiding citizen. I merely have 2 legally registered, domestically bred agricultural poultry, kept in a county-approved enclosure, exactly as permitted by the HOA bylaws." The older cop looked at me like I had 3 heads. "Poultry? Sir, I grew up on a farm in Georgia. I know what a chicken sounds like. That is not a chicken." "You are correct, officer," I said. "It is a peacock." Before Brenda could start screaming again, I opened the binder of justice and handed it directly to the older cop. "If you'll turn to the blue tab on page 3, officer, you will see the current Palm Beach County Agricultural Code. It explicitly classifies peafowl, under the taxonomic family Phasianidae, as domestic poultry. If you flip to the yellow tab on page 5, you'll see my building permits and my purchase receipts proving domestic origin." I paused, looking directly at Brenda. "And if you look at the very first page, you'll see the HOA bylaw, drafted by the board, allowing me to keep 2 of them on this property." The older cop took the binder. He looked down at the plastic-sleeved pages. He read the HOA rule. He flipped the page and read the county code. He looked at the highlighted definition of Phasianidae. He flipped back to the HOA rule. He stood there in silence for a full minute, reading. Slowly, a tremor started in his shoulders. He bit down hard on his lower lip. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears of suppressed laughter. He realized exactly what was happening. He recognized a masterclass in malicious compliance when he saw one. He handed the binder to his younger partner. "Read this, rookie." The younger cop took the binder and read the highlighted sections. He didn't have the decades of stoic restraint his partner possessed. The rookie let out a loud, sudden snort, immediately slapping a hand over his mouth and turning away to hide his face. His shoulders were shaking violently as he tried not to laugh out loud. Brenda was losing her absolute mind. "What are you doing?" she screamed, stepping toward the cops. "What are you laughing at? Did you hear that noise? It's a nuisance. It's a violation of the peace. Arrest him." The older cop took a deep, shuddering breath, composing his face into a mask of pure, stone-cold professional seriousness. He took the binder back from the rookie, closed it respectfully, and handed it back to me. He turned slowly to face Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with forced, heavy authority. "I have reviewed the documentation. Everything on this property appears to be entirely in order." "In order?" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing off the beige houses. "Are you deaf? Listen to it!" "Ah!" Kevin chimed in, right on schedule. "Ma'am, it is legally classified agricultural livestock," the cop explained patiently, looking down his nose at her. "Loud noises are to be expected with farming activities. In fact, Palm Beach County has very strict right-to-farm laws that protect agricultural noise from local nuisance complaints. This man is running a legal, permitted agricultural operation." He paused, leaning in slightly. "If you have an issue with the bylaws allowing farming in this neighborhood, you need to take it up with your HOA board. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one." "I am the board!" Brenda screamed, stamping her foot on the pavement like a petulant toddler. "Then I highly suggest you go home and write a sternly worded letter to yourself," the older cop replied, absolutely deadpan. He turned away from her, tipped his hat to me, and gave me a subtle, respectful nod. "Keep up the good farming, sir. Come on, rookie, we're done here." They walked back to their cruisers. As the rookie got into the driver's seat, I could clearly see him burst into hysterical laughter behind the glass. They threw the cars into reverse and rolled away down the street. Brenda stood on the curb, completely alone, looking utterly defeated. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes filled with a level of pure, venomous hatred I had never seen before in a human being. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper. "You think you've won because of some stupid technicality? I will call an emergency board meeting tonight. I will rewrite the bylaws myself. I will have you and those miserable, filthy birds evicted by Friday if I have to physically drag them out of here myself." "I look forward to the meeting, Brenda." I smiled, turning around and walking back up my driveway. I went inside, locked the door, and listened to Lord Shen let out another triumphant, echoing scream. The battle with the police had been won. But Brenda was right. The war was far from over. She was going to pull out every dirty, underhanded trick in the HOA handbook to change the rules and get rid of my birds. She thought she still had the power, but she had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her at that emergency meeting. She had no idea that I hadn't just found a loophole. I had found a nuclear legal option that was going to salt the earth of the Boca Raton Estates Homeowners Association forever. I mean, honestly, after the police cruisers rolled out of sight, leaving Brenda standing on the curb looking like a deflated pink balloon, I could have just stopped there. I could have gone inside, locked the door, and spent the rest of my lease tormenting her with the majestic screams of my legally protected poultry. But like I said before, this wasn't just about the birds anymore. This was about completely dismantling a tyrant. Brenda had made the fatal mistake of thinking she was the smartest person in the room, and I was literally about to show her what happened when you let that kind of arrogance blind you to state legislation. I spent the rest of my Friday completely ignoring my actual job. I called in, took personal time, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and my binder of justice. The police had confirmed I was operating within the HOA guidelines, but Brenda had made her next move crystal clear. She was going to change the guidelines. She was going to weaponize the board, hold an emergency vote, strike the agricultural exception from the bylaws, and then use the new rules to force me out. It is the classic, dirty playbook of every power-hungry HOA president in the country. Change the rules in the middle of the game so you never lose. But I knew something she didn't. I spent 6 hours deep diving into Florida state law. Not county codes, Not zoning ordinances, but rock-solid supreme state legislation. I was looking for the ultimate trump card. And man, did I find it. I printed out the statute, highlighted the relevant paragraphs in bright, neon yellow, and slid it into the very front pocket of my binder. By noon, the neighborhood was already buzzing. I could see people whispering over their fences. The Peacocks were keeping a relatively low profile during the heat of the day, mostly just lounging in the shade of their massive 10-foot enclosure and occasionally letting out a soft, guttural cluck. But the damage from the morning had been done. At exactly 2 p.m., Brenda's retaliation arrived. I saw a teenager on a bicycle riding up and down the street, stopping at every single mailbox. He was frantically shoving pieces of neon yellow paper into the slots. When he finally got to my house, I walked out and grabbed the flyer before it even hit the metal. It was printed in bold, frantic capital letters. Urgent. Mandatory emergency CHO meeting, tonight, 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. Agenda, immediate amendment to Article 4, Section B, ban on all poultry, fowl, and livestock, and immediate removal protocols for non-compliant residents. Attendance is critical to preserve property values. She was trying to fast-track it. She bypassed the standard 2-week notice required for a bylaws amendment by declaring a community emergency. It was highly illegal, entirely unethical, and absolutely perfect for my plan. The hours ticked by. I showered, shaved, and put on a clean, pressed button-down shirt and a pair of slacks. I didn't want to look like the unhinged, rebellious renter Brenda was going to paint me as. I wanted to look like a guy who was completely, terrifyingly in control. At 6:45 p.m., I tucked the binder of justice under my arm and started the walk down the street toward the community clubhouse. The Florida evening was sweltering. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled like freshly cut grass and chlorine. As I walked, I noticed people stepping out of their front doors, locking them, and joining the procession. The entire neighborhood was turning out for this. Some people shot me absolute death glares, clearly blaming me for the screeching alarm clocks that had ruined their morning. But a surprising number of people gave me subtle nods or quiet smirks. Brenda had terrorized this community for years with her measuring tape and her fines. A lot of these people didn't care about the Peacocks. They were just showing up with metaphorical popcorn to watch someone finally stand up to her. The clubhouse was a depressing, single-story stucco building sitting next to the community pool. It smelled heavily of damp towels, industrial bleach, and stale Folgers coffee. Normally, these meetings had maybe 5 people in attendance. Tonight, the parking lot was completely full, and golf carts were parked illegally on the grass. I walked through the double-glass doors and into the main meeting room. It was packed. There had to be at least 80 people crammed into cheap metal folding chairs. The room was buzzing with loud, angry chatter. But the moment I stepped through the doors, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entire space. Every single head swiveled to look at me. It felt like walking into a saloon in an old Western movie. I ignored the stares. I walked slowly down the side aisle, keeping my posture straight and a polite, neutral smile on my face. I found an empty folding chair in the very back row, sat down, and rested my binder on my lap. At the front of the room was a long, folding banquet table covered in a cheap plastic tablecloth. Sitting dead center was Brenda. She had changed out of her pink tracksuit and was now wearing a sharp, aggressive navy blue blazer. Her hair was perfectly sprayed into an immovable helmet. She was flanked by 2 other board members. To her left was Arthur, a guy in his late 70s who looked like he had been dragged away from watching Jeopardy and wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of this. To her right was a woman named Susan, who looked terrified, clutching a notepad to her chest. Brenda was holding a wooden gavel. A literal, actual wooden gavel. I literally almost laughed out loud when I saw it. She glared at me from across the room. Her eyes were dark, filled with a vindictive, triumphant energy. She truly believed she had won. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Brenda stood up and slammed the wooden gavel down on the plastic table. It made a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the silent room. I call this emergency session of the Boca Raton Estates Homeowners Association to order, Brenda announced, her voice projected and authoritative. We are bypassing the reading of the previous minutes due to the extreme, critical nature of tonight's agenda. She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned forward, addressing the crowd. As many of you were tragically forced to witness this morning, a resident has maliciously exploited a severely outdated loophole in our community guidelines. This individual has brought 2 massive, aggressive, and highly disruptive exotic beasts into our neighborhood. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the front rows. Mr. Johnson, who was sitting in the second row, crossed his arms and nodded vigorously. These creatures are a public health hazard, Brenda continued, her voice rising in pitch. They are a devastating noise nuisance that violates our right to quiet enjoyment, and frankly, they are an insult to the aesthetic standards that keep our property values high. She paused, making sure everyone was hanging on her every word. Then, she pointed her gavel directly at me. This board will not tolerate this flagrant disrespect. Tonight, we are introducing an emergency resolution. We will vote to immediately strike the agricultural exception from Article 4, Section B. We will replace it with a total, unyielding ban on all poultry, fowl, and livestock within the boundaries of Boca Raton Estates, effective immediately upon the conclusion of this vote. She picked up a piece of paper from her table. Furthermore, any resident found in violation of this new amendment will be given exactly 12 hours to remove the animals, after which they will be fined $500 a day until compliance is met, followed by the immediate filing of a line against the property. The room was completely silent. It was a brutal, ironclad resolution. She was bringing the hammer down, and she wanted everyone to know what happened when you crossed her. Brenda set the paper down and looked at me, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had me backed into a corner. She thought I was just some dumb renter who had played a prank and was about to get financially ruined. Now, Brenda said, her voice dripping with fake, sugary politeness. According to Robert's Rules of Order, before we take the vote, the floor must be opened for discussion. Does the resident in question have anything he would like to say in his defense? This was the trap. This was her grand finale. She wanted me to stand up, lose my temper, yell, and make myself look like the unhinged, crazy neighbor in front of the entire community. She wanted to solidify her narrative that I was a threat. I didn't yell. I didn't even stop smiling. I stood up slowly from my metal chair. I picked up my binder of justice. I stepped out of the back row and began walking down the center aisle of the room, my footsteps echoing on the cheap linoleum floor. I stopped about 10 feet away from the front table. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked directly into Brenda's eyes. "I would love to speak, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice calm, steady, and loud enough for the entire room to hear without shouting. "First off, I just want to say how incredibly impressed I am. The speed at which you drafted this amendment, printed those flyers, and organized this meeting, it shows a level of dedication to community standards that is truly, honestly inspiring." Brenda's smirk faltered slightly. She narrowed her eyes, instantly suspicious of my calm demeanor. She gripped her gavel a little tighter. "However," I continued, pacing slowly from left to right, "I strongly urge this board and this community to very carefully reconsider this vote. And I am not saying this for my sake. I am saying this for the financial survival of the entire Boca Raton Estates Homeowners Association." That got their attention. The murmuring stopped completely. People leaned forward in their chairs. Even Arthur woke up a little bit, squinting at me through his thick glasses. "You see," I said, opening my binder and pulling out the brightly highlighted document I had prepared earlier. "While Brenda was busy sprinting around the neighborhood shoving flyers into your mailboxes, I was doing some light reading. Specifically, I was reading up on Florida state legislation. I held the document up so the room could see it. Does anyone on the board, or anyone in this room, know what Florida Statute 823.114 is? Dead silence. Brenda looked at the paper, then back at me, a tiny flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. I didn't think so, I said, walking closer to the table. It is the Florida Right to Farm Act. It is a very powerful, very strict state law that was designed specifically to protect agricultural activities from nuisance lawsuits and overreaching local ordinances. I stopped right in front of Brenda's table and placed the document gently in front of her. I tapped my finger on the neon yellow section. The law states unequivocally that any agricultural activity that is legally established cannot be subsequently declared a nuisance due to a change in local ordinances, zoning laws, or neighborhood conditions. I looked up, panning my gaze across the terrified faces of the other board members, before locking eyes with Brenda again. When I purchased my peafowl, and when I brought them onto my property, they were 100% legal under the existing HOA bylaws. Palm Beach County legally classifies them as poultry. The county permitted the enclosure. Therefore, my peafowl are legally established agricultural livestock. Brenda let out a loud, mocking scoff, though I could see her hands actually shaking slightly. This is a private HOA, you idiot! We are not a farm. State agricultural law does not apply to our private community contracts. Actually, Brenda, it literally does, I smiled, leaning forward and resting my knuckles on her plastic tablecloth. State legislation supersedes private HOA covenants. It is a fundamental rule of law. But don't just take my word for it. Flip to page 2 of that document. She hesitated, then aggressively flipped the page over. If you pass this amendment tonight, I explained, projecting my voice so every single homeowner could hear the trap snapping shut. You are attempting to retroactively criminalize a protected farming activity. My poultry are grandfathered in under state law. If you vote to ban them and you attempt to fine me $500 a day, or if you attempt to forcefully remove my property, you are in direct violation of the Florida Right to Farm Act. I paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the stale, chlorinated air. And if you do that, I said softly but clearly, I will immediately file a massive lawsuit against this board. And here is the kicker about the Right to Farm Act. The law mandates that the prevailing party in these suits is entitled to full compensation for all legal fees, court costs, and punitive damages. I looked at Arthur, who was now sweating profusely, and Susan, who looked like she was about to cry. You won't just lose the lawsuit, I told them. The resulting litigation will completely bankrupt this HOA. You will drain the reserve funds paying your lawyers. Then, when you lose, you will have to pay my lawyers. The pool will be drained. The landscaping crews will be fired. The property values you all care so much about will plummet, and this community will be financially ruined because your president couldn't handle the sound of a few birds. The room exploded. It was absolute chaos. People were shouting, jumping out of their chairs. Mr. Johnson was yelling at Arthur. Susan had her face in her hands. The entire front row was panicking, demanding to know if what I was saying was true. He's bluffing, Brenda screamed over the noise, banging her gavel frantically. Crack, crack, crack! He's making it up! It's a scare tactic! Order! I demand order! Am I bluffing? I asked loudly, cutting through her shrieks. Call the HOA's legal counsel right now, Brenda. Put him on speakerphone. Let's ask him if he wants to go up against the Florida state government over a peacock. She froze. Her hand hovered over her cell phone sitting on the table. She stared at me, and I stared right back. She knew I had her. She knew I was right. I could see the exact, precise moment her absolute authority shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. The color drained completely from her face. Arthur, who had been silent this entire time, suddenly stood up so fast his metal folding chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. He grabbed the microphone sitting in the center of the table. Motion to immediately dismiss the proposed amendment. Arthur yelled, his voice trembling with sheer panic. "I'm not losing my retirement pension to fight a damn Peacock lawsuit because Brenda got mad about some wind chimes." "Seconded!" Susan yelled instantly, practically leaping out of her seat. "All in favor?" Arthur shouted into the mic. "Aye," roared almost every single person in the room. The sheer volume shook the cheap ceiling tiles. "Motion dismissed. The bylaws remain entirely unchanged. This meeting is adjourned." Arthur slammed the microphone down, grabbed his keys, and basically ran out the side door of the clubhouse. Susan was right behind him. The room erupted into frantic conversation as people started filing out, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief, a few of them actually laughing. Brenda sat alone at the long table. She was completely frozen. Her gavel slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the linoleum floor. She slowly looked up at me. Her face wasn't red anymore. It was a terrifying, chalky shade of pale gray. Her perfectly constructed kingdom had just been burned to the ground in front of her entire court, and I hadn't even raised my voice to do it. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She stood up, grabbed her clipboard, and walked stiffly out of the room, her perfect posture entirely gone. She looked small. She looked defeated. Rumor had it she drafted her official resignation from the board that very night, slipped it under the clubhouse door, and put her house on the market 3 weeks later. She couldn't show her face in the neighborhood anymore. The sheer embarrassment of being legally outmaneuvered by a renter and 2 peacocks was too much for her fragile ego to handle. I walked out of the clubhouse and into the warm Florida night. The heavy humidity felt absolutely fantastic. I didn't walk fast. I strolled. When I got back to my house, I walked straight through the living room, unlocked the glass door, and stepped out onto my patio. I looked up at the edge of the awning. The metal hook where my little $12 bamboo wind chimes used to hang was still empty. But I honestly didn't mind the silence anymore. I didn't need them. Because I knew, in just a few short hours, the sun was going to start threatening to rise over the Boca Raton estates. And right on schedule, Lord Shen and Kevin were going to wake up in their completely legal 10-foot-tall, county-approved fortress. They were going to puff out their chests, throw their iridescent blue heads back, and scream their glorious, chaotic, legally protected lungs out over the pristine, beige golf courses. And there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. I took a deep breath, kicked my feet up onto a lawn chair, and smiled into the darkness. Peace, at last.